Hello, good evening again. This is International Master Oladapo Adu, and I have a very interesting game to show us today. And this game was played at the Tata Steel, which was played earlier this year in Holland. And I think this is the 13th round. And it was a game between the eventual winner of the tournament, which is Grandmaster Wei Yi from China, and Vidit Santosh. Gujarathi from India. It's a very interesting game, and it's a game that actually has to do with an isolated queen's pawn. So before I get into the game, I'm going to say some things about you know what do you do when you're playing on the side of the queen's isolated queen's pawn, and when you're playing against it. Now, if you're anytime you're playing against an isolated pawn, your plan is to blockade the pawn, stop the pawn from moving, and then find a way to attack the pawn and then capture the pawn if you're playing against an isolated queen's pawn. And this is a known plan, especially if you're someone that have an idea about the Alapine variation of the Sicilian defense. Now, if you're on the white side of an isolated queen's pawn, your plan is pretty much to create attacking chances against the opponent's king. And this is a very interesting game that talks about that. So let's get right into it. Um, we just started with the move d4, d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, e3. Now this is a very quiet setup from the white point of view. Quiet setup. Things could get very crazy very quickly. So after the move e3, um, black plays c5, putting pressure on the d4 pawn immediately. So white plays c3. This is a very solid system for white. Nothing adventurous, because if you look at the position right away, white has a pawn chain, which looks kind of good. All right. And the drawback against the pawn chain is the bishop on c1. The bishop on c1 it's not developed, and it's kind of bad for now. Why? Because the pawns on the dark squares are blockaded it. So that means white light square bishop is actually good. So after the move c3, e6 was played, bishop d3. Now that's always the best diagonal for the bishop. Anytime you're playing against a system with the f7, g7, h7, you want your bishop to be on d3 most of the time. And of course, the only time you don't want your bishop to be here is if it's a fianchetto. And that means the bishop is on g7. And then with this kind of pawn chain, your bishop doesn't really have a whole lot doing. So bishop to d3, knight d7. Normally, the classical development of the knight should go to c6. The knight should be on c6. That's the classical development. Pretty much putting more pressure on the central squares. So after knight b d7, and white plays knight b d2, and then bishop d6, another strong square for the bishop, puts pressure immediately on the h2, and of course the central squares. White castles, black castles, rook e1. White is doing everything to get his pieces on the best squares, and at some point in time, he's probably maybe going to take or push. These are the possibilities. Because in chess, anytime you're playing and you have your pieces on good squares where you want them to be, the next thing is to try to open up the position by moving pawns. So rook to e1, queen to c7, immediately putting pressure on the h2. So we have to watch out for that. Now e4. Now this is what I'm talking about. It's very important to play e4 here. And the reason being that by moving the pawn to e4, after the capture on e4, either with the pawn takes, c takes, d takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes, bishop takes, all of a sudden the bishop on c1 can get in the game through g5, h4, and then bishop to g3. These are possible things that can happen for the white pieces. So after the move e4, and now one thing we also have to know with the move e4 is by moving the pawn to e4, white will be saddled with an isolated queen's pawn. And like I said, this is one of the reasons why I'm doing this video, because of this position. It's a position you're going to see a lot of times. Like for example, if you're playing on the white side of the alapane, and a number of also queens pawn opening. So after the move e4, um, captures on c takes d4. After c takes d4, um, c takes d4 back. Now, looking at the position, let me go back one step. So after the e move e4, c takes d4, c takes d4, uh, d takes e4, knight takes e4. Now there are no more pawn tension in the center. That means all the pawns have been exchanged, right? And what has that done to the position? Let's look at it pretty quickly and try to come up with some deduction. Now, we could see that with the exchange of the pawns in the center square, bishop on c1 is able to get on the game either through g5. By moving the bishop to g5, you vacate the c square for the rook, which puts some pressure on the c file. Now, if you look at the position, white, you could say white actually had the better out of the exchanges of the pawns. You could say that because now his bishop can get in the game. On the other hand, white is being saddled with the isolated queen's pawn. Like I said earlier when we started this video, anytime you have the isolated queen's pawn, you have to attack this king because there is no maneuvering you want to do in this position that's going to really make you compensate for this weak d pawn. And white, yeah, so white has to start keeping an eye on keeping some play on this part of the board. So after the exchanges, b6, of course, very logical move. What's the point of b6? Getting the last minor piece in the game. And by moving the bishop either to b7, you immediately connect your rooks. Now you have to decide where are the best files for the rook. For example, the f rook can be on e8, it could be on d8. Meanwhile, the a rook can either be on c8 or d8. But if you look at this position critically, it's very obvious to us that the a rook belongs to the c file. And why is that? If you move the rook to b8, it's doing absolutely nothing because that's the closed file. So the next open file is the c file. So here we can move the a rook to the c file, which puts some pressure on that c file. Meanwhile, the f rook can come to the square e8, but you're not really doing much here either, although there's a possibility of this file getting open. But I think the best square for that rook would be the d8 square, where it's already having some things to do there. So after the move b7, bishop to g5, yeah, that's what I mentioned earlier. Now, bishop to g5, putting pressure on the knight, threatening to bring the rook to c1. Very innocent position. And this position has been played, a couple of times by some top GMs. So let's keep going. Knight takes, rook takes. Now, this is an interesting move here. Rook takes e4. Now, remember what I said earlier. Anytime you have the isolated pawn, the queen's pawn, most of the time, you have to attack this king. Now, the knight captures on e4, rook captures. Let's remember this. The knight on f6 had a role. What is the role of the knight on f6? It's the main defender of the black's king's position, especially the very critical square h7. Now, we don't have that knight on f6 any longer. And its place cannot be replaced because there's a bishop takes f6, which actually just messes up black's position. So right now, the plan is pretty simple for white. White must create some attacking chances on the king side. And black must find a way to actually exploit this pawn, but it's really hard to do that right now. Normally, when you're playing against an isolated queen's pawn, you actually want to have this knight on c6, not d7, because the knight on c6 put immediate pressure on the pawn. And with the knight on c6, you have a possibility of blockading the pawn. And by blockading the pawn, right, you stop the pawn from moving, and then you have some possibilities around the white position. But that's not the case right now. The knight can't get to d5 via f6 because the bishop takes f6 just crushes the position for black. That would not be a good idea. So rook takes e4. The idea of rook takes e4 is to transfer this rook to attack the king's position. So bishop b7 was played. Tempo. improves the position. Now, of course, rook h4 is going to come at some point, but it's very important for you to make sure all your pieces are placed on the best squares possible. So rook c1 was a very nice intermezzo in between both. Um, After the move rook to c1, um, queen goes to b8. Now, not such a good square for the queen, especially with the rook not being able to get in the game. But it's very important for the queen and the bishop to maintain the battery on h4. But there's a little problem here. If you look at the position, even though we don't have any pawn chains, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces that can easily go attack the black king. And we really don't have any minor pieces around this black king. So that's a red flag. That's a red flag. And let me remind us, this game is being played by two strong grandmasters. These are not pushovers. These are not people that really don't know what to do. The white GM's rating is 2740, while the black is 2740. So these are super grandmasters that have been in this position several times. So after the move, queen b8, rook h4, logical move. It's a multi-purpose move. Apart from the fact that the pressure is on h7, so anytime bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, the rook defends the h2 square. So now we have all these pieces threatening to invade on the black side. Interesting, right? At this point in the game, I like to always ask this question. I wonder what the Vidit had in mind when he got to this position. Because already the engine said this is advantage for white, +1, actually. Personally, I would say, at this point, it's been a flawed opening. So that means I don't think he really knew what he was getting into when all the exchanges were made. All of a sudden, white is looking very active. So rook h4, f5. Now, in chess, we're always told, this is one of the principles I follow. You don't move a pawn where you're being attacked. Because what you do is, when you do that, you kind of compromise your position the more, unless you have no choice. But let's look at the position very well. So what else would have been a better move for black? Definitely not h6, because I guarantee you there could be a sacrifice here that pretty much just opens this position. And I think knight g5, probably knight g5, bishop check, queen h5. I mean, h6 would not be a good move. And I don't think g6 would be a good move either. If the move g6 was played, and then the dark squares are really weak. So how can we continue this? Let us see. Can knight here be played? Not necessarily. Can we play queen? We can't play queen to e2. Queen e2, queen a3 is not really going to do much as well. But the fact is there is queen e2 is a very interesting move. Sorry, queen to e2. No, there's bishop takes f3. We don't want to do that. So now another possibility, like I said, is to either play g6 or h6. h6 is a no-no because the bishop takes can be very strong. Now with g6, I'm not so sure how white can continue the attack, because the rook can easily come to the c file, transfer either the bishop to the g7 square to try to defend the dark squares. I'm not so sure of what this position says. Let's see what the engine says. This is really bad. Queen a4 is actually very strong. Queen a4 is very strong for white. Queen a4 puts pressure on the knight, and yeah, queen a4 is a very strong move. It's kind of hard to defend the knight, and the knight doesn't really have any jumps, right? You can't defend the knight with the rook because the bishop is there. You can't bring the queen to c8 because the rook is there. What if you bring the queen to e8? Then we have rook. No, we don't have rook to c7. Oh, we have bishop to b5, putting more pressure. So this is already looking very bad for black. But let's get back into the game. In this position, f5 was played. After the move f5, bishop to c4. Immediately there was a weakness created on the e6 square. Immediately white goes for the square. e6. Bishop to c4. The idea is just take the pawn, win a pawn, and of course win a piece with it. So after the move bishop c4, queen to e8. Defends the pawn on e6, and also probably in some situations come to the defense of this king. Anytime your king is in trouble, the best piece to defend that king is the queen. So queen e8 makes some sense. After the move queen e8, bishop to queen to b3, putting pressure on the e6 pawn. And remember, if this pawn was still on f7, then we wouldn't have to bring all these pieces to put pressure here. But one thing is, in chess, this happens a whole lot of time. You know, when opponent creates a threat, forces you to create a weakness, and then just puts pressure on the weakness. This is a very good case of that. So queen b3, king to h8. What's the point of king h8? So that bishop takes e6 is not a check. It's very important because, for example, bishop takes e6. There's bishop takes f3. If queen takes, you're going to lose that bishop. But there's always the in-between move of bishop takes d7 followed by queen takes f3. So let's see what happened after the move king h8. Rook to e1, pressure on the e6 pawn. So white is not about to let go the pressure he has on black's position just for the sake of a pawn. Now, if we go back to the beginning of this video when I mentioned when you have an isolated pawn, you have to attack the white, you have to attack the king. And when you're playing against the isolated pawn, you want to stop the pawn from moving. It's kind of hard for black to try to even come up with trying to stop this pawn right now. Why? Because of all the multiple threats white has on the black position. In fact, the rook, the bishop, the knight, even the possibility of the queen switching to the king side is so intimidating for the black pieces. So let's keep going. Bishop to e4. Okay, trying to block the pressure on the e file, trying to, do something about the pawn on e6. Even though bishop takes e6 is still possible, I don't think. Yeah, why not? It's definitely possible. Bishop takes e6 is possible, just a pawn, and I don't think there's anything black can do about that. So let's see what. Yeah, so white wins the pawn, still with the pressure on the board. Bishop takes e6, queen g6. Bishop to d2, moves the bishop to safety. Now black is the pawn down. Has this position improved? Not really, because there's still possible threats on this black king. And one thing I normally say is when you have a piece, especially when you have a king that has no squares to move to, that's a red flag because any check can mate that king. So after the move bishop to d2, knight to f6. Of course, the knight f6 is the idea of trying to defend the position and also try to create some of his own threats against the white king's position. So knight g5. White is trying to throw everything in. To start with, there's a f7 is a very strong possibility. And why is that? f7 belongs to the black pieces. It's only defended twice with the rook and the queen, and it's attacked 3 times: the bishop, the queen, and the knight. So it's something black has worried about. Actually, the immediate threat is just bishop f7, winning the queen or probably winning the game. Yeah, bishop f7 just traps the queen because you cannot go to the h file because of the h, the rook on h4, and captures, knight captures, knight takes, but we have to also watch out for the mate on g2. So after the move, f4 was played. Okay, what's the point of f4? Blocking the bishop from protecting the knight. So for example, knight check doesn't work because it's just going to take it. If you capture, it's going to mate you on g2. So in this position, we have to be very careful as white. Now we have there's a pressure on g2, actually double pressure. There's an x-ray attack, there's a direct attack. So white has to be very careful to not get mated in this position. And at the same time, he has to try to find a way to up his attack. And one thing about this position is white does not necessarily have to just keep throwing all the pieces in there. Remember, it's the pawn up already. and will be very active and very intimidating pieces. So after the move f4, rook takes h7. Wow, he strikes immediately. Rook takes h7. And it's interesting because we have one, two, three pieces on the square h7. Now, after rook takes h7, one thing we want to also remember in this position is, of course, you can't use the queen. You lose your queen, you lose the game. So the only alternative, other alternative you have is to capture the knight. But then let's don't forget this. The knight actually has more than one purpose here. Apart from the fact it's defending the h7 square, he's also defending the bishop on e4. And while white is attacking the bishop on e4 twice. But this is the thing. Why did white give up his rook for the pawn on h7? Pretty much the sacrifice is a positional one with some, we say it's a positional sacrifice giving up the rook, because at the end of the day, the king will have 0 squares to move to. Because of the bishop, the knight, and the possibility of the queen switching to the king side, the rook on e1, there's a whole lot of stuff going on this position. And one thing I also want to point out is the rooks are not active right now. Even though black has the 2 rooks, they really are not really part of this game. So rook takes h7, knight takes h7, knight takes e4. So let's look at the position again. What did white gain with the exchange sacrifice? Number one, the control of the light squares is very important. And number two, the fact this king cannot move in the game is also very important. And number three, the fact that the queen can switch to the king's side, put more pressure here, is also one thing we have to worry, black has to be worried about. So after the move, knight takes e4, attacking the bishop on d6, f3 was played. You have to play f3. You have to play f3. Because number one, you want to stop the queen from being able to switch to the king side. And number two, by playing f3, you probably bring your rook into the game, create some threats. So here, I think you have to stop the checkmate, number one, by moving the pawn to g3. Yeah, you have to stop the check. But the good thing about this position for white is now we can always, we have the light square bishop to defend the light squares that are around the king's position. Meanwhile, black doesn't have that. But this is the question. How does white continue with this position? Okay. He would have to find ways to put more pressure on this king, one, because already you're down an exchange, even though you have, I think you have 2 pawns now. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, it's 5-1. So after the move g3, bishop to e7. Of course, what's the point of bishop to e7? That there was a immediate threat on the bishop, so the bishop had to move. Bishop to e7, d5. It's a multi-purpose move. Apart from the fact you're protecting the bishop, you're also giving yourself an opportunity to move the bishop to c3 to put pressure on g7. You also have the opportunity of pushing the pawn further down to create a pass pawn, which is very dangerous. So these pieces are really looking very intimidating for the black king. Remember, the black king doesn't have any squares right now. And you can't even say you want to move your knight to f6, because this knight can easily go to g5, pick up the pawn on e4, sorry, on f3, and then knight goes back to e5. 2 pawns up with a very weak king. It's not looking so good for the black pieces. So rook to d8, a rook to d8, trying to get the rook into the game. Of course, you don't have the c8 square because of the bishop, and there's no other square you can actually move the rook that's going to create any kind of threat. So rook to c8, rook a d8 makes some sense while leaving the f rook on the f file. So queen to a4. What's the point of queen to a4? If we look at this position, black has 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 pieces defending the king, and white has maybe 1, 2, 3. It will make absolute no sense to try to force something here, because you already have enough pieces defending than attacking. So it makes absolute no sense. So what's the next thing to do? Get as much material as possible. So what's the point of queen a4? Probably just to capture the pawn on a7. If you get a pawn on a7, the one on b6, that's two connected pass pawns. So, and even though black is an exchange up, we cannot figure out this rooks really can't do much right now. If you think about it, for example, the rook on f cannot go to f7, you can't go to f6, you can't go to f5, you cannot go to f4. So pretty much that rook is useless. What about the one on d8? You can't go to d7, you can't go to d6. Another useless rook. I'm sure in this position, if black had a minor piece, it would have been easier for him to defend the position. So after queen a4, a5, you can't afford to lose pawns. You're already down like I think one or two. You're already down 1, 2, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, already down 2 pawns. You can't afford to lose more pawns. That way, your position will be really compromised. So queen to c6. The simple threat is just to win a pawn. Simple threat is just to win a pawn. So after move the queen to c6, bishop to b4. That's an interesting move. Why is that an interesting move? Because if this bishop can get exchanged off, now there can be some ease on the dark squares, where black can actually try to operate. So that's an interesting move. And bishop captures, a captures, h4. What's the point of h4? Stopping the knight from getting into the game, one. And if the knight decides to come through f6, we already have an anchor for the knight on e4 on g5. And the knight on g5 immediately still puts pressure on f7, puts pressure on f3. So very interesting position. Like I said earlier, the rook takes h7 was more of a positional sacrifice. It pretty much compromises black's position. So black really has to do something with this rook. But unfortunately, there is no whole lot of things the black rooks can do. So after the move h4, makes a lot of sense. Get the rook to the open file, try to create some play. If you can capture the pawn here, get into the game, capture the other pawn, black can somehow try to save the game. Of course, knight went to d6. What's the point of knight d6? Because now this pawn is kind of free. So what's the point of knight d6? Um, do we have any threats? I mean, this is always there, so I won't say that's the point. Oh yes, the threat is knight f7 check. I think knight f7 is interesting because, for example, if rook takes, there's knight f7 check. If rook takes, there's queen check on e8. Your rook cannot go back because I simply take the queen and then that's just curtains. And if the knight goes back, bishop takes. This is what I'm talking about. If, for example, rook takes, there's knight check is very strong. If rook takes, there's queen check. You cannot move the knight back because bishop takes is just crushing. And this is hanging. And you cannot move the rook back either because you simply lose your queen and the game is pretty much over. So we pretty much know this pawn cannot be captured. So after the move knight d6, rook to a7. Does that move make sense? Yes, it does. Why? He immediately stops the threat we just talked about. That's one thing I always say, and you see a lot of strong players do this thing. When a threat is created, you stop the threat unless you have a stronger counterattack. So rook a7 pretty much stops the threat. Now, let us look at black's position again. What exactly does black have? Black is an exchange up. But does white have compensation for that exchange? Yes, it does. He has 2 pawns. Apart from the 2 pawns, it does. White have another thing to show for the exchange? Yes, it does. This king is compromised. The king cannot move. And the light squares are very weak. And of course, the minor piece can't really get into the game yet. Knight is actually trying to defend this king as much as possible. And it's just a matter of time. And I think in this position, now this is weak. This is weak. And interestingly, we still have a rook here. We haven't got into the game yet. So let's see what white did here. Queen takes b6. Rook takes. Now, we don't have the same combination here because the queen doesn't have the e8 square. So what happened after that? Queen to c7. Now, this is a very strong threat. So he has 3 pieces on f7. So what's the point? For example, if the rook captures on b2, this is a very strong move. Check. If the king moves here, knight check, yes, and then queen is dead. So we don't want to do that. So black must do something about that threat. After queen c7, knight f6. What's the point? The king can get out without coming into the pin. Remember I said earlier on the king is very compromised. Why? Because he has absolutely no squares to move to. Now the knight has made a way for the king to move. So let's see what happened after that. Knight check anyways. After the knight check, king goes to h7. Knight goes to e5. Attack the queen. We have multiple threats here. There's bishop here, bishop to f7. Um, Now the queen doesn't have that square on f5. The queen doesn't have the square d4. The queen doesn't have the square d3. The queen doesn't have the square c2. So it's looking really bad for black. Well, it's always been looking really bad for black, but I should just say just getting worse. So after the move knight to e5, and let's remember this: black is an exchange up. Well, this is the problem when you have some kind of advantage and you cannot use it. It's like you really don't have it. So in this position, these minor pieces are way stronger and they have more effect than the major pieces. So knight e5, queen goes to h6. It's interesting that the queen has always stayed around this king, rightfully so, because the best way to get the king is to get the queen away from that vicinity. And at this point in time, it's almost impossible for this queen to vacate the king's side. Once this queen get away from the king's side, this king is going to get captured very quickly. So queen h6, just sticking around, trying to stay around the king for as long as possible. And the best pieces actually to defend your king is, apart from being the queen, is are your minor pieces. Rooks are very bad when it comes to defending the king. So queen h6, queen check, pawn push, knight takes, good move. Now you cannot capture the king because you're going to be in check. And you cannot capture the queen because it's a bishop f5 pinning your queen to the king and winning the game. So the move, rook was made. What's the plan? What's the point? He has to do something. Moving away from danger, probably trying to exchange off the rook and maybe try to use the exchange. But it's actually a little late here because the king has no covering. The king has zero covering here. So what happened? Knight check. Look at this. This king is pretty much open. There is nowhere for that king. After the knight check, king moves to g7, queen to c7 check. And at this point, black resigned. Very interesting game. Looking back at this game, we could say the turning point of this game was, personally, this is what I feel. The turning point for this game was knight takes e4. Yes, this point. After b6, bishop g5, bishop knight takes. I think this is the turning point. But the thing is, what else could black have done here? Because when the knight captured on e4, bringing the rook into the position, it became a lot of problem for black, and the position just went downhill because it's one weakness after another weakness after another weakness. And like I've rightfully said, anytime you have an isolated pawn, you have to attack the king. It's not the time to start playing positional chess because already your position is nothing to write home about anyway. You have an isolated pawn. So the only thing you can have that can count for you is to create some attack on the king. Of course, they're going to be pawn pushes. And now the pawn pushes are going to create more weaknesses. And after that, it's just going to be difficult for black to defend. So now there's a pressure on e6, like we said, and the game kept going on. And it was just very difficult for black to defend the position. And note, the rooks are so useless when it comes to defending the king. And I think, like I said, this was the round 13 game. And after this game, I think there was a playoff that Wei Yi won, and he became the winner of the Tata Steel. Okay, so that's it for now. And like I said, the idea of this game is actually to check out what you do when you have an isolated queen's pawn. Hopefully, there will be another time when we can have a situation where we can have something similar so that anytime we have a position, we always want to have an idea of what to do. And right now, after a couple more moves, after black shield had been totally taken off by several checks like that, it was, I mean, nothing protecting the king. That's why we always advise, always make sure you have a pawn around your king's position. Pawns are very important. And after that move, queen c7, black resigned, and that was it. All right, thank you very much for this. Your feedback is appreciated. Yeah, and see you next time. Have a good one. Bye.